Hello, hello, hello. A little bit more in the way of unusual recording circumstances. Thanks for your patience. Hopefully, it's an interesting little break. We are continuing on with our discussion of the news media and our need to be thoughtful and critical of how we engage with the news media, particularly in what we are reading about this week is the what we call the attention economy or surveillance capitalism. So I assigned you to read two articles this week. Both of them are written by the journalist Ezra Klein. And as I've said throughout the semester, it's always really important for you to stop and research anyone whose things you are reading and that you are intending to learn from, to know who they are, what their expertise is, and where they're coming from in terms of their potential biases. So who is Ezra Klein? He is a journalist who now is at the New York Times, but previously he worked at the Washington Post. He was a blogger in the late 1990s, and he helped to found Vox, which is usually focused on explainer media. He also was a talking head at MSNBC. So you get a sense of his politics from these things. Now at the New York Times, he hosts a podcast that is one of the most influential political podcasts in the nation. So, for example, he was the first public figure to start calling for Joe Biden to step down and not run in the 2024 election. And the conversations that Ezra Klein spurred around this call for Joe Biden to step down, in fact, ultimately ended in Joe Biden stepping down. So Ezra Klein is a highly influential journalist among decision makers. He may not be someone that you are personally very familiar with, but among the politicos and the news elite of the country, he's a highly influential journalist. So those are things to know in terms of his alliance with the New York Times, so one of the most powerful news organizations in the nation, that, as we talked about in the last video, have been responsible for things like misinformation around Kitty Genovese's death, or leading us into war against Iraq without any reason to be invading that country. So all of that as background for the very interesting conversation that he puts forward in the two pieces that I'm asking you to read this week. So I wanted to note a couple of places in what you read for this week that tied to our terms from the list of logical fallacies. So I'll read this out, and then what I want you to do is write down the logical fallacy that you think is represented here, and then see whether or not what you wrote down is in fact what I say afterwards. So it's a little quiz for you on your own terms. Quote, Democrats believed 44% of Republicans earned more than $250,000 a year. It's actually 2%. Republicans believed that 38% of Democrats were gay, lesbian, or bisexual. The correct answer is about 6%. Democrats believed that more than 4 in 10 Republicans are seniors. In truth, seniors make up about 20% of the GOP. Republicans believed that 46% of Democrats are Black and 44% belong to a union. In reality, about 24% of Democrats are Black and less than 11% belong to a union. So these are all examples of what logical fallacy? What would be the term that would describe all of these examples given in this quote? One term for all of them. What would that be? Write it down. And then on the next slide, we'll see whether or not you were correct. So the term is hasty generalization. Democrats are using a misrepresentation of Republicans, and Republicans are using a misrepresentation of Democrats. So they're imagining that a small group is in fact representative of the larger group in a way that is inaccurate and therefore fallacious, therefore a logical fallacy. And this logical fallacy is hasty generalization, to take a small group to misrepresent a larger group. All right, how about this one? Quote, polarized media doesn't emphasize commonalities. It weaponizes differences. It doesn't focus on the best of the other side. It threatens you with the worst. So this isn't a precise logical fallacy, but this is related to one of the terms that we've talked about this semester. So what is it that polarized media are doing that is captured here in this quote, and what logical fallacy does that relate to? Go ahead and write down your answer, and then I will give you mine on the next slide. So I would say this is an example of the news media using our negativity bias against us, because we are more likely to be attentive, to be interested. If we can be scared, then the news media will threaten us with things that scare us using our negativity bias against us. We've talked about the relationship of news media to negativity bias a lot already. This is another example of exactly that the news media will almost always focus on the negative, the scary, the what we will perceive to be dangerous as a tool to grab, hook, hold our attention. Okay, so in the last video, I talked about the Iraq War, and I asked you to write down what your answer was for why it was that we invaded Iraq. So I want you to think back and ask yourself, did I get it right? Did I know the reason why our country invaded Iraq and was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people? Did I know why that happened? And if you didn't write down that there were lies from the Bush administration about weapons of mass destruction, that's not your exact answer, then I want you to ask yourself why. And note that you're not alone, that in my in-person class most recently, there was no one in a class of 36 students, not one single person, was able to say that it was a lie around weapons of mass destruction that took us into the invasion of Iraq. So if you were not able to answer correctly, know that you are in fact not the exception, but the rule. Most students in Cal State Long Beach, and I would guess in the nation as a whole, are not able to answer this question. And I want you to think about why that is and what the relationship of the news media is to that. Of course, it's also a question of our history classes and other conversations that we have, our education, but this is related to the news media as well. So why is it that you are not aware of the true history of this war? So my suggestion to you would be that the reason why so few of us know the answer to the question about the Iraq War is related to Chomsky and Herman's theory of how it is the news gets made, which is what they call the propaganda model that we talked about in the last video. The idea that the news media become a form of mouthpiece for the powers that be within the country, so that there is a relationship between the news that gets covered and the way that it gets covered and the interests of the wealthy and the powerful who own those news media. So in the Ezra Klein pieces that we read for today, there's a quote related to that. The fundamental thing the media does all day, every day, is decide what to cover. Decide, that is, what is newsworthy. Here's the dilemma. To decide what to cover is to become the shaper of the news rather than a mirror held up to the news. So the news media, of course, should be some transparent, objective version of the information that's necessary for our democracy to function properly. So it needs to hold up a mirror to what is true objectively, when in fact what really happens is that there are people inside the news media who constantly make decisions related to the filters of ownership, advertising, sourcing, flack, their own careers, and their own internal biases. All of this comes together to shape the news in a way that makes the news a form of propaganda as opposed to a form of objective truth. So just a reminder of those filters again, they are ownership, advertising, sourcing, flack in the original model, which we can call also metrics or cancel culture, and fear-mongering and outrage. And the way in which the news media operates within the social media environment means that the stories are often shortened, flattened, simplified in ways that make them lose the nuance that they need in order to be fully reflective of the complexity of the issues at hand. In terms of fear-mongering or an outrage, there's a reliance in the news media on hasty generalizations, on negativity bias, and on availability bias, which you'll remember from earlier videos. We've talked about that in relationship to stereotypes and circulating narratives that people use to interpret what they come across. But those narratives may, in fact, make it difficult to see reality for what it is. So the news emerges not from individuals seeking to improve the functioning of democracy, but from readers seeking diversion, reporters forging careers, and owners searching for profits. A reminder of that core description of how the news media actually operates, as opposed to the flagship fourth estate that it purports to be or understands itself to be. So now we need to understand this term, the attention economy. The news media have always existed in unattention economy, but that attention economy has changed over time in ways that are significant for how the news itself has been and is being told. So the attention economy is the economy in which various factions, various corporations are vying for our attention and want our attention in order to be able to feed us ideas, feed us interests, feed us taste in ways that will shape what we buy, how we vote, where we go, what we do, right? So it is the attention economy. It exists in order to influence our behavior, influence our ideas, and ultimately influence our behavior. So let's think about the news media in the context of this wider attention economy. Initially, the news operated largely on newspapers that were distributed fairly locally and that were owned independently and that often competed with other local newspapers. And over time, we of course had the rise of radio, which allowed us to have a more national audience for news in a way that earlier newspapers couldn't do the same thing that radio did. But there were fewer radio stations, and everybody was hearing more or less similar news stories. Especially that was true when we went to broadcast television. So when television started to take over from radio as the primary place in which people watched news, then we started to see a convergence of the news media around a more centralized, shared set of ideas and norms, because the news media in the era of broadcast television were largely operating for national audiences And they were competing against only about 3 or 4 channels, if you include public television as well. So we had CBS, we had NBC, and we had ABC. Those were the primary 3 news sources that were competing against each other. The ways in which they would tell the news were aimed at bringing in the largest viewership possible. And they needed to be as general as possible in terms of the politics involved in order to not really offend people and in order to be as generally palatable as possible. So that centralized the politics. It centered the politics in those news agencies. But also during this time frame, everybody got the news because anyone who had a television and had access to broadcast TV, those 3 basic channels, you might get a TV because you wanted to watch I Love Lucy or you wanted to watch cartoons. But if you had a TV, then you also got some news. It was just part of what it meant to have a television. You got news. So no surprise, the nature of creating the news has really changed in the era of cable television and then the advent of the internet and especially social media. So whereas under broadcast television, the news media attempted to be as all-encompassing and palatable and centrist as possible so as not to exclude anyone, and everybody knew a little bit of news, so everybody had some idea about what was going on in the nation just because they happened to have a television. Things changed a lot when we started to have cable television, because when we got cable television, people no longer automatically got news in their daily feed. Instead, they had to choose to go and watch the news on a news channel, and they could completely avoid the news altogether if they didn't want to go to a news channel, which meant that there started to be news that was created specifically for people who really liked the news and who were very interested in the stories of the news, as opposed to news that was created for everybody, the entire nation. So it started to bifurcate the way in which the news got told. Cable television became more polarized as it targeted interested and identity-based groups that were particularly attracted to both the news and to politics. Whereas increasingly there became a group of people who got no news whatsoever because it wasn't already folded into their daily television feed. And then as we moved from cable television to the internet era, we started to see the rise of people creating news on the internet without actually being journalists, without being trained, without being vetted, without having the ethics that journalists are trained in. And so we started to see the rise of fake news sites that purported to be real news organizations, but in fact were created instead to spread lies, because lies oftentimes are quite fascinating and so attract attention, and then you can sell advertising on that website if you attract a lot of views. So we started to see the rise of fake news websites in the era of the internet. And then as we've shifted from the internet into social media, we've seen the dissolution of news organizations altogether. And we've seen people getting no news whatsoever because they're instead lost in their individual interests, as opposed to sharing a conversation with each other on a shared newspaper or a shared television station or a shared radio station. So the news media, as it has evolved, has pushed the journalists who are writing for it to cater their stories increasingly to the identities of people, because people then are more interested in reading those stories, or has pushed them to write their stories in ever more sensationalizing, polarizing, upsetting ways, because those are also the things that attract people to click and read. If something is enraging, if something is fear-mongering, if it's scary, or if something is, it seems like it's speaking to your specific identity, then those are the things you're going to click. So in an economy in which, an attention economy in which the news journalists are competing against all of the little cat videos that are out there. They are competing against all of the various multitude of interests you might have, whatever it is that's in your normal feeds. News media has to compete against all of that in order to give you the news. Then it's going to start to shape the news in ways that is more similar to your social media feed, because then you'll click, you'll read. So the news has become increasingly more identitarian, more fear-based, and much more conspiratorial in nature and much more polarizing. So the shift from newspapers to television to cable television and now to social media has seen us get increasingly polarizing news that is increasingly identitarian and increasingly more fear-mongering. So these are important things to understand. It's not that the news has always been this way, it's that it has become increasingly this way as the media environment has shifted. So the rise of social media has created polarization in a variety of ways, but particularly as it has pushed journalists to write more polarizing kinds of stories, because those kinds of stories get more clicks and get more interest and engagement. And they're operating in a system in which they need that in order to make money. So here's a quote kind of bringing that home. When we're going for retweets, or when our main form of audience feedback is coming from highly partisan social media users, it subtly but importantly warps our news judgment. This is a journalist, Ezra Klein, talking about the ways in which journalists get changed and remotivated by this new media environment. It changes who we cover and what stories we chase, and when we cover politics in a more polarized way, anticipating or absorbing the tastes of a more polarized audience, we create a more polarized political reality. So, why is the news media more polarizing today than it used to be? The answer is because in a social media environment in which the attention economy is increasingly more competitive, there's that many more choices for our time and attention, then it has to get ever louder, ever more identitarian, ever more polarizing in order to gain clicks, in order to gain engagement. So it's pushed our media to become more that way, which has then pushed our politics to become more that way. People who then engage with and consume that kind of news are then going to have increasingly polarized politics. So an important note about newsworthiness. What even is newsworthiness? What makes something newsworthy? And what's important to note here is not that it is objectively a reflection of what our democracy needs to know or hear. Rather, it relates to the biases of editors and journalists themselves. So reading the quote here, the political media is biased, but not toward the left or the right, so much as toward loud, outrageous, colorful, inspirational, confrontational stories. It is biased towards the political stories and figures who activate our identities, because it is biased toward and dependent on the fraction of the country with the most intense political identities. This is a really key idea, that what we're seeing reflected in the news media of today, of the era of social media, is not that which is inherently newsworthy or that which we inherently need to know about, but rather it's responding to this changed environment in which the most intense political identities are those that can be pulled in by the news media within the larger attention economy. So the lack of interest that people have felt in the news media is precisely what pushes the news media to become more polarizing and identitarian in order to get those people who will respond at all. So the connection between the changing news media environment and who it is that actually consumes any news media anymore really is a question of personal interest. It's interest. So if you are interested in news media, you are likely to consume it. And in order to get you interested, the news media becomes more about your identity, and it tries to push your political buttons in ways that will keep you more and more engaged. So interest is the biggest indicator of whether or not you're going to engage with the news media at all. That didn't used to be the case. It used to be the case that it didn't matter whether you're interested in the news or not, or politics or not. You got news, you got politics, because it was in everyone's television every night. So you were exposed to it, whether you were interested or not. Today, it's only those who are interested, which means that the news then reflects their more identitarian politics. So that's the reason why the news has become more polarized and more polarizing, is because of the changing environment in which the news is produced. The evolution from newspapers to radio to broadcast television to cable television, when we started to see this major shift where interest mattered. If you were interested, then you got news. If you weren't interested, then you didn't get news. And then that got hyperactivated in the era of social media, in which there's so many other things to be interested in. It's very unlikely that you're going to get any news or know any news unless you have some interest in it. And so then there's this disjunct between those that know and care about news and those that don't. And those that know and care about news, they drive it to be increasingly extreme, because that's the nature of the attention economy and the feedback loop that happens there. So one of the articles you read for this is called "The Medium is the Message." So I want to focus in on what exactly that means. It means that the news is always shaped by the thing through which it is told. So the way in which the news is told from a newspaper, within a newspaper, like an actual paper newspaper, to the way in which the news is told in a long form magazine, to the way in which the news is told on broadcast television every night at 5 or every night at 6, to the way in which the news is told on cable television, especially if it's on a 24-hour cycle of news, to the way in which the news is told in a very short video clip on Instagram. Those different forms, the medium, actually shape and constrain the way in which the story itself gets told, or the news itself gets told. And so if you're only consuming your news on Instagram or Twitter, then the kind of place that you're operating, the medium itself, becomes the form of it becomes the politics of the news itself. So it makes it more simplistic, less nuanced, catchier, shorter, and ultimately less reflective of the complexity of the realities that are out there. So just to reiterate again, social media create a very flattened, simplistic, and in many ways inaccurate form of news reporting. And that then becomes a message because it creates a flattened, less nuanced, and less complex kind of politics. So by many of us, the majority of us now, consuming our news on social media, we have, in a sense, a dumbed down, less nuanced, less complex kind of news media and kind of politics taking place as a result of that. So as a takeaway, I want you to be able, in the exam on this portion of the class, I want you to be able to explain this evolving history of news media, going from newspapers to broadcast television to cable television to the internet and to social media, and how that has changed the way in which the news media have been able to tell their stories, and then how the ways in which the changing stories have in fact changed the politics of the nation itself. So again, that feedback loop of the changing medium changes the way the stories are told, and the way the stories are told changes us, and we change the politics, and it all becomes ever more polarized. And ultimately, knowing this relationship between us and social media and the news media, I would suggest should give you pause um, about getting your news on social media. I would suggest to you that's a terrible place to get your news, and that you ought to get off of social media and go to long form versions of news in, as I mentioned in the other video, in the form of magazine articles, in the form of books, in the form of long form podcasts, as opposed to quick, short videos or little quippy quotes on X. Those are not, in fact, good ways to become informed, because it becomes a flattened version of reality that is not healthy for any of us. So, as critical thinkers, we should move off of social media in order to get our news on a daily basis.